Welcome back to SommBox, and congratulations on your purchase of one of my absolute favorite boxes, which is very near and dear to my heart for so many reasons. Of course, I've said time and time again, I am a huge Burgundy fan. I'd like to think that of the generational gap here with Somms, maybe I'm kind of one of the OGs since I went out there to work the harvest for the first time in 2004, and then again in 2006. Back then I had met a very notorious and famous Volnay personality, Nicolas Potel. May he rest in peace. Unfortunately, just passed very recently and sadly. But he was my introduction to basically everything. He taught me about Burgundy, about the culture, about the vines, and really about life. But of course, he's stemming from one of the most famous domains in all of Burgundy, let alone Volnay, which is Domaine de la Pousse d'Or, which his father, Terroir Box, founded. And of course, until his passing in 1996, when Nico was forced to leave the domain and find his own way. We'll get to that in a moment, but also, of course, I can't talk about Volnay without having one of his wines in the box. But what I really wanted to do with this box is give you a complete overview of Volnay in all of its incredible aspects. Volnay is not only my first love. I'll never forget sitting in a little wine bar in Chicago. My first sip of Volnay Ronceret. It was a 1998 vintage from a winemaker who has become a great friend over the years, Nico Rossignol. Also not in this box, but I would highly encourage you to look out for all the great producers that I wasn't able to include in these 6, but Nico is certainly one of them. And this beguiling perfume and this impossible elegance in the glass and this such alluring, flirty, I can't call it sexy per se, but it's a flirty attractiveness about it, because as I call this box the Audrey Hepburn of Burgundy, it's never something that's loud or that's in your face or pushy. It's just kind of batting its eyelashes at you from across the bar. Very demure, but incredibly beautiful. And you can really smell its intoxicating perfume from just that far away. So not only is it such an easy wine to fall in love with, it's maybe one of the greatest villages in Burgundy. If you look at just the vineyards, over half of the hectare designation is under Premier Cru. And while it doesn't officially have any Grand Crus, like Pommard or Merceau, it's kind of a pity because there are a couple contenders. What I wanted to do here is show you the whole gamut, from the Village up through some Liudis, Premier Crus, from the Pommard side down to the Merceau side. Because like other villages in Burgundy, let's say Moët-Saint-Denis, where the vines from the Gevrey side differ wildly from the Chambolle side, Volnay is very similar. So Monsieur Jean Gevrey wanted to show you an impeccable example of refined, perfumed Volnay from the village level, which are normally blended from several sites. So unless you find a single site Volnay Village, which I would say is a little bit more rare, what you're going to get is a mixture of different vineyards, perhaps depending on where the winery is situated. In this case, more on the Merceau side, because of course, Gevrey is also known for fantastic Merceaus. But it's not just the side of the village, it's also the situation within the village. You have on the bottom of the village very much darker, deeper soils, the more sort of reddish irony content. And then as you go up the slope, as you would in Morachet, for example, when you get up to Chevalier, a much more hard, active limestone layer and much thinner soils that are visibly lighter colored and whiter if you're looking up the coat, for example. So you would expect the racier, more structured and elegant wines from up above, the nervier ones, and then down the slope, these rich, decadent, flamboyant, sort of round and spicy and sort of powerful styles of Volnay coming from the bottom. So with some Village wines, you'll get a perfect balance of all of these elements, which might be the best impression of Volnay. From others, you might get a more sort of Merceau and upslope version, and from other producers, a Pommard side and downslope version. So Volnay, although it has a very distinct character, can also be a tiny bit of a chameleon. One thing they all have in common, though, is of course that entrancing beauty. So then we move over to some other incredible things. For example, the Pommard side. So starting with my mentor, my teacher, and one of my great friends, Nicolas Potel, with his Volnay Les Pitures. This is very much on the Pommard side and a little bit downslope. So typically speaking, these are going to offer you a little more of that Pommard character. As I mentioned, the iron-rich thing. That's what Pommard is known for, right? If you drink a Clos des Epnos, for example, maybe one of the most brutal expressions of this iron-rich, gamey, almost sanguine, bloody, meaty version of Pommard, which I find in some hands the Volnay Pitueur can also offer. So when you drink this, also bear in mind, this was Nico's second vintage as a négociant, when he was basically forced out of his own domain, the Domaine de la Pousse d'Or, the house that his father built. They had accepted some investment to purchase more vineyard holdings from some foreign investors. And as his father tragically suffered a heart attack on the way back from the vineyards one night and tragically passed, essentially overnight, or at least very, very quickly, shares were purchased internally, thus making Nico a very minor owner of his own domain in almost the blink of an eye. So Nico was basically kicked out as this new concern, new company, basically had other ideas for the globalization and internationalization of this amazingly hallowed domain. And the wines these days, one can argue if they're great or not. All I know is that having tasted so many of Gerard's Volnays, his Claude Le Boustor, his Claude Le Soissons Gevrey, even his Pommard Jarrière and his Volnay Cailleret. And I mean, these wines were monumental, but much more in the old school. Harsh tannins, loads of structure, brisk acidities. This is really echoing the sort of OG camp of Volnay, such as de Monty and Lafarge, and the old school d'Angeville as well. You know, these were not what you would expect out of a dainty, fine little Volnay. These were absolute powerhouses, and they needed decades to mature. This was only his second vintage after, as I said, he was forced to do something other than what he had grown up with his entire life. And he founded a négociant firm, thankfully, because Burgundy is such a tight community. And of course, everyone is very sympathetic of everyone else. And in Volnay, let's face it, everybody's related. There's only a handful of last names, whether it's the Rossignols or the Boyots or whoever it is. You know, it's a very tightly knit community. And so people, obviously the winemakers had a lot of sympathy for Nico's plight, and he was able to access grapes from absolutely incredible producers with incredible plots and truly make some fantastic wine, even though the sort of hipster way to look at Burgundy is very black and white, that the négociants are garbage and the tiny, highly allocated domains are the best. And that is certainly not the case, as we see with other houses like Bouchard and Jadot, which produce absolutely legendary wines from some of their best vineyards. And Nico is certainly no different. And although I respect his sources enough to not mention who they are, that's something that you don't do in Burgundy. Trust me when I say that he was able to source absolutely remarkable fruit. Now, what you see in this glass of 1998 Le Pitueur, not the easiest vintage, a little bit cooler, a little bit more difficult to work, oceans away from 1999 the next year, which was maybe the largest and most sort of warm, easy crop that Burgundy had had in a very long time. Then it was very different. And so what you'll see now is a true evolution of Volnay at its absolute peak. This sous-bois, this forest floor, the mushrooms, the earth, a little bit of this bloody sort of grilled meat and that iron thing in there that I was talking about, the Pitueur, with of course these, let's say, well-aged florals and things like this. I think just a fantastic example of Volnay. Moving along to the center of the village, we have the Thomas Bouley, Claude Lacave. Bouley, I had the very distinct pleasure of meeting him in 2004 and 2006 when I was there. And I believe it was in 2004. His father, who he had taken over for in about 2002, not officially until later, but he started. His father turned 100 on that day that I was there. And stupidly, with my young, boyish, overexcited sort of mentality, was eager to ask him, what was the greatest wine you ever had? And he replied, I don't know. We're probably going to make it next year. And it really put things in perspective for me. You know, it's like with all these great vintages he's experienced personally and made with his own hands, if it's 47 or 59 or 78 or 85 or 90, he, with his 100 years of age, was still looking towards the future and not looking back. And I feel like that pioneering spirit is very much present in his son, or his sons, I should say, both of them, the Bouley brothers, having continued their father's sort of pathfinding methods of, organic farming back in the day when organic wasn't really a thing, and taking it even farther to more low intervention, even biodynamic farming, concentrating on incredibly low yields, clonal selections, Massal and things like this, which really, I think, make these wines some of the purest and most beautiful in all of Volnay, especially in a modern sense. And the Clos de la Cave is a little, as the Clos would suggest, walled vineyard, smack in the middle of the village, behind the Domaine, not very far from, of course, the Marquis d'Angerville, Clos de Duc, which maybe some of you know, and which could be argued as one of the true top wines of Volnay, maybe even should be up for something like Grand Cru status if it were ever to happen. And the purity and the poise and the balance of these wines is absolutely impeccable. You would expect it to come from the heart of the village when it tastes like this, and well, it does. Then we move on to the rest. Heading down towards Meursault, one of the most important parts of the village between the two vineyards of Les Champons and Clos des Chênes. Of course, Les Champons being more in the direction of Les Pétures, but somehow Champons is it's like it sounds to me. It just rolls off the tongue, Champons, in this little puff of sort of roundness and weight, and it has such a beautiful perfume and decadent fruit with this lightness that seems completely unlikely. It ages beautifully, it's stately, it's one of the gentlemen of Volnay, let's say. And from Marquis d'Angerville, especially in a vintage like 17, which is not the greatest vintage by any critic's score, but a vintage which right now is so open and so beautiful and so transparent. It's, again, going back to the no bad vintage, only bad wines thing, but these are the vintages that as a Burgundy drinker, we should be celebrating because we don't have to wait 25 years for them, and they give so much joy after just 8 to 10 years, and they tell you the entire story without having to have so much patience. And the style of d'Angerville is such a historical house. One of the first to Domaine bottle, actually, along with the Rossignols and Gerard Potel from Pousse d'Or, back in the 50s and 60s, when the Burgundy trade was dominated by shippers who would purchase barrels, do whatever they did with them in their own warehouses, sometimes a little bit of magic, sometimes a little port wine, sometimes a little brandy, I mean, if you've ever had a great wine from the 20s or 30s that tasted a little bit too fresh, or maybe kind of alcoholic and kind of dark and port wine-like, I think you know what I'm talking about. Not that it always happened, but no, let's face it, it did. These were some of the first guys, and Volnay was one of the first villages to take that matter into their own hands and to share equipment to bottle their own wines and make sure that the wines got to you as they were intended to. And also, of course, what was common back then were to just blend vineyards together, which maybe weren't very well known, and then just put, smack a generic label on it. Oh, it's just Volnay. Maybe there were 3 Premier Cru vineyards in there, but back then they didn't think anyone cared, and they weren't going to make them care because they were the ones in charge of the bottling. So this really was a massive step forward for all of Burgundy, not just Volnay, and d'Angerville and Lafarge are certainly two to be thanked for that. Which leads us to Michel Lafarge. Honestly, one of my absolute favorite winemakers in Burgundy for so many reasons. Not only my personal history with the Domaine and with him, as he was very close to Nico and I've spent quite a bit of time there, but as I grew up with Burgundy in the early 2000s, the style was a little bit different. We didn't have these flashy, very polished kind of things you're seeing these days. A lot of them were quite more on the rustic side, more angular, a little more rough. And Michel Lafarge was maybe the one who comes to mind if you describe that, as you would think about maybe Henri Gouge in Nuit Saint-Georges or Jean Griveaux in Von Romanée. Now this is a 2003, right? Clos des Chênes. 2003 was an epic vintage, but also a very misunderstood vintage. I remember tasting all the 03s out of barrel as I was, of course, working the 04 vintage, and every winemaker had a completely different and very polarizing opinion of this vintage. Some said, it's California wine, it's garbage. Others said, I have no idea what I made, we have to wait and see. Others said, legendary vintage, unprecedented, maybe the greatest of all time. Others said, when I asked, well, how do you feel about the overripeness and lack of acidity, said to me, I'll never forget this at Mounier-Gibourg, son, what are your favorite vintages? And of course, stupid young me replied, like I just rattled off, 45, 47, 59, 66, 78, 85, 90. And they said, yeah. And you notice something there, smart guy? All smoking hot vintages, all of them, with alcohols spiking through the roof, with acidities dropping so drastic that in 47, Mounier-Gibourg's back then parents were getting big blocks of ice in burlap sacks and chucking them into the vats to keep the temperature down and to provide some water, like you were adding pasta water to a red sauce, to dilute it a bit before it all evaporated out and concentrated like a marmalade. I mean, they had no temperature control back then, but there were very hot vintages, and these are the ones that we today talk about as legendary. And somehow, at the same time, insult modern warm vintages like 03 or 09 for being imbalanced. So these kinds of discussions actually kind of tick me off. And now that we're finally, and I noticed back then out of those barrel tastings, yes, there were some wines which were overripe and they were too much. There were some poor decisions made in the vineyard. But there were so many domains where these wines were absolutely captivating. They were flamboyant, they were broad, they were structured, so much depth and so much also precision. It wasn't like bad music. It was just like taking great music and cranking the volume to 11, you know? And this is certainly one of them. And the Clos de Chêne is one of those vineyards that is not the most elegant, is not the most refined in Burgundy. It is burly, broad, rough, big, as it would sound like, Clos de Chêne, like it used to be a forest full of snarling beasts. That is how this wine comes out of the bottle, especially in a domain like Michel Lafarge, where the style has not changed ever. And these are truly some of the relics of the old school Burgundy, if you really want to know or interested in what that tastes like. Then on the absolute last border of Volnay, Meursault, of course, we have the Centenot from Darviot-Perrin. Darviot-Perrin is one of these domains which we're seeing, I think, in such an exciting way in Burgundy now, which the next generation taking over from the parents and just slightly, kind of like Bouley, slightly just kind of, you know, turning the steering wheel just a tiny little bit, going towards biodynamics, purity, clarity, and elegance more than raw power and rough edges. And this is certainly the case for Darviot-Perrin. The Centenot is also just an incredible vineyard, although it's literally on the border of Meursault, so much so, part of it's in Meursault, so much so that the white wines in this area, which are Volnay, are called Meursault, and the red vines on the Meursault side are usually called Volnay. So this is literally a gray area. But you have distinct elements of this Centenot vineyard because it is fairly large, some of the best of which being the Centenot de Milieu. And the thing about these wines is, as you sense the proximity to Meursault, there's an incredible nerviness and almost anxiousness about these wines that makes them so shimmering and vibrant and alive, and completely the opposite of a Clos de Chêne or a Péture. They can be long-lived, highly perfumed, and absolutely gorgeously long. And I think there's some of the most stunning examples of Pinot Noir in Volnay. So if this doesn't sell you on my love of this village, I honestly don't know what will. But I suspect that after these 6 wines, you will really understand how diverse and beautiful and deep this village is, and why this truly is one of the best interpretations of Pinot Noir on the planet. So, as we say, à votre santé and à tout à l'heure. Till the next time on SommBox.